slept better when it was colder in the room rather than warm?
They are right. We need to be cooler to sleep, and there's actually our core body temperature drops when we sleep, and so for a lot of people, keeping their house at a cooler temperature at sleep can be helpful. Scientists have suggested somewhere around 68 degrees. Of course, depending on the person and their power budget, 68 degrees may not be an option, but the cooler you can sleep, if somebody is really struggling with their sleep, one of the things that I would encourage them to do is to keep a sleep log for a week. Write down, notice what you're doing. Are you going to bed and waking up at relatively the same time every day? Is there a lot of variability? How much alcohol are you consuming? How much exercise are you getting? How much time are you spending in bed compared to how much time you're actually sleeping? And that may give us an idea about where some of the challenges are and where we can start to make some of those changes.
Nightmares affect up to 70% of trauma survivors, and many people find that nightmares continue long after traumatic events.
When it comes time to dream, our brain will pull imagery that matches our mood. For people who go to bed anxious, they may find that they have more anxiety-filled dreams. For people with a history of trauma, going to bed in that anxious or irritable mood, they may find that they have more images coming back from their trauma experience, that over time, if our brain keeps pulling that same imagery, it creates this script of the nightmare.
Some people experience sleep paralysis. Scientists think it's like they're half awake, half asleep. Do you think it's part spiritual too, or do you think it's just biological?
So this is something that has been written about for millennia. It shows up in lots of different cultures, and lots of different meaning gets assigned to sleep paralysis. And so you may wake up and be aware but unable to move for a few seconds. It can be really terrifying for people. With that, sometimes people will see things or have images, which is where kind of the spiritual piece comes, is as people will talk about a hag or a witch riding them, or they'll talk about seeing figures, aliens, ghosts, other kinds of images that may have a less than solid form. Whenever I'm working with anyone who experiences sleep paralysis, I want to know if you're awake, you're alert, you're irritable, you're angry, you're scared. We don't want to strengthen that relationship with the bed. Get out, do something different. Quiet, calming, relaxing, and when you notice that biological cue for sleepiness, where your head is heavy, your eyelids are heavy, get back in bed. In the long run, it's going to make a big difference in your quality of sleep.
All right, we're back. It's been a while, but hey, it's been the holiday season. So we have a very special guest today. Before I introduce her, I want you guys to think about something. Why can you feel exhausted all day, but when the moment you finally get to bed, your brain is suddenly awake? Why do so many adults lie there replaying conversations, planning tomorrow, or feeling the heart race, even when their body is begging for rest? Stress keeps us wired, trauma keeps us alert, nightmares keeps us up at night, and insomnia becomes a nightly battle that drains our energy, focus, and mental health. Today, we're talking about sleep and why it's become so difficult, even for people who feel exhausted, and what you can do about it using simple science-based tools and techniques.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why we have brought on today's guest, someone who's a leader in understanding sleep, nightmares, trauma related insomnia. Dr. Courtney Worley is a diplomat in behavioral sleep medicine and a board certified clinical psychologist. She specializes in evidence based treatments for insomnia, nightmares, trauma, and depression. She trains clinicians across the country and co-authored the book, The Nightmare and Sleep Disorder Toolkit.
Dr. Worley, welcome. And before we dive into practical tools, what led you into the world of sleep disorders and nightmares, and what made you passionate about helping people finally get the rest they deserve?
Thanks so much for having me today. This is definitely an area that I think will be of interest to a lot of people. Everybody can kind of relate to having insomnia as a symptom, a bad night of sleep here or there. And one of the things that really drew me to this area was how universal the problem can be. I started out my professional career working with veterans with trauma in an intensive trauma treatment program. And one of the things that we noticed, even after treating their trauma, that oftentimes they had some lingering sleep complaints. And so this really led me to do a deeper dive into the literature to find out what was going on and how we could help people address whether it was just difficulty sleeping, what we commonly think of as insomnia, nightmares, or some of the other co-occurring sleep conditions. And so we went in and looked at some ways in which we could pair evidence-based treatments for trauma and evidence-based treatments for insomnia to help people kind of address those lingering sleep concerns that were really disrupting their quality of life.
Hmm. Yeah, that connection makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure you've helped so many throughout your experience. I would love to dive right in, kind of exploring why so many adults struggled for to get sleep, to get good sleep.
Mhm.
According to the CDC, 1 in 3 adults isn't getting enough sleep. That's an extremely high ratio. And yet, so many people are feeling exhausted all day. Something isn't adding up. Specifically, what we're doing in our day to day isn't conducive to allowing us that sleep either.
Yeah, and in your book, you describe hyperarousal, a state where the brain stays on high alert even at bedtime. For someone who feels tired all day but suddenly alert at night, can you explain what hyperarousal is and why it keeps the brain from settling down?
Absolutely. So there is this challenge that our brain maybe gets busy with all kinds of things throughout the day, going and working and taking care of our families and doing all the things that we need to do. And then when we settle down at night, it kind of goes, oh, great, now we've got time to work on X, Y, or Z. And so sometimes that's when all of the things that you maybe didn't have a chance to process or work through during the day comes up. For some people, especially the people who've been exposed to trauma, which is about 70% of the world, and then a smaller subset of those, maybe another 10% within that of 6 to 7% who have post-traumatic stress disorder, that time becomes a time where their avoidance strategies are no longer as effective, the things they've done to push away unwanted thoughts, memories, and emotions. And it all comes up kind of when we slow down, when we stop, when we rest. Regardless of whether there's trauma exposure there, this idea of hyper arousal, which sometimes we talk about as feeling tired but wired, comes up because there's this disconnect between the state that our body needs to be in to go to sleep, the state of relaxation, and this arousal, this wired feeling that's happening where the body is trying to address its sleep need, but our brain is just not winding down, it's not shutting down. In that state of hyper arousal, understandably keeps people from falling asleep, but it can also change the quality of that sleep throughout the night. And specifically, when it comes time for us to have dreams, it can make it more likely that people will have nightmares because the brain will pull imagery to match that state of anxiety or hyperarousal.
And so, can you talk a little bit about how hyperarousal connects with this other concept in the book of conditioned arousal, where people are teaching, actually conditioning their brain to become in that activated space. So, if you could just talk to us a bit about the connection between the two.
So when we think about stages of alertness, of consciousness, we often think about this idea of being asleep or awake. And we have this biological drive to sleep. We also have what's called a circadian rhythm, which is our body's way of trying to keep us aligned with a roughly 24-hour Earth day. Most people want to be awake during the day and asleep at night. And those two things need to be in alignment for us to get the kind of rest that we need. And we can sometimes, though, power through, even though we've got this sleep drive built up that we're exhausted, this hyper arousal can power through. So, this idea of being really anxious, alert, and for some people on guard, depending on their past experiences, depending on their current sleep environment or current living situation, there may be reasons to be alert or on guard if you have concerns for safety in the home or outside of the home, assuming you are housed. And so, this idea of conditioned arousal comes from classical conditioning. Some of your listeners may remember Pavlov and Pavlov's dog and how things that occur together get linked. And so, for Pavlov and his dogs, it was the sound of the bell and the presentation of food meant that the dogs would start to salivate. And over time, they didn't even need to see the food, they would just hear the bell, and this biological process would happen. And so when everything is going right, we want our body to be conditioned to associate the bed and sleep. And so once we get in bed, our body knows that we are ready to go to sleep. We relax and we sleep for a period of time that meets our sleep need, and that's individualized. And then we get up and do it all over again. For people who are having trouble sleeping, they often do other things in the bed. Sometimes that's the first time that they're stopping in the day and they spend some time thinking or ruminating, chewing over worries or issues that have happened. For some people who've been struggling with insomnia and think, I'm not going to get to go to sleep here tonight, they may end up doing other things like reading or watching TV. Some people eat in bed or talk on the phone or, doom scroll, other things that happen. And over time, this connection of bed and sleep is not so strong. And so it's like there's this menu of choices when we lay down at night. Instead of I am laying down to go to sleep, my brain goes, okay, which of these 10 options am I going to do? And so it keeps people awake, even though they may be physically tired, even though their sleep drive might be high. There's this disconnect. And over time, they learn to associate the bed with being awake and sometimes being irritated because they're not sleeping, or worried or anxious or fearful because of those other pieces that have come to be associated with the sleep and the sleep environment.
I definitely relate to that. As you were speaking, I'm just like, yep, check that off the list, check that off the list. There's definitely room to be more, conscious about what you are doing in bed, and the idea that you are conditioning the activities. That is, it makes a lot of sense. It does.
Yeah. For the listeners whose mind race at night, what's one simple technique they can try at night, maybe from your toolkit to interrupt that cycle or to break that association, the other associations with bed and sleep?
Yeah. So we're getting a 2-for-1 here. You're kind of asking about two different options. So let's talk about it. In the Nightmare and Sleep Disorder Toolkit, we go through a lot of these pieces of trying to tell people what are some of the things that you can do if you find yourself in this tired but wired state, right? And so a lot of the tools we use are working on increasing relaxation in bed. And so if my brain is kind of working on all kinds of different problems, let's give it something else to do that is going to promote that relaxation response. And as part of the book, one of the things that was really important to me, because it's something that I do in my daily practice with people who are struggling with their sleep, is we built in several different recordings of relaxation exercises, and they're free and available online on the New Harbinger Press website, where you can do deep breathing, you can do a progressive muscle relaxation, we do guided imagery. So having this other tool, and there are lots of those things available out there in the world and on the internet, but having this tool to bring on the relaxation response can sometimes help people. Sometimes that's one piece of a much larger toolkit because it takes more things to help. The second part that you asked about was kind of how we can get this conditioned arousal broken up. And one of the things that sounds so paradoxical, and I often get a lot of raised eyebrows from patients, is to tell people to get out of bed. Because one of the things that when we struggle with sleep and we feel like we're not getting enough sleep, we often do is spend more time in bed, right? If I just lay here a little bit longer, maybe I'll go to sleep, or I'll catch up by sleeping in a little later on the weekends. But all of that kind of sends mixed signals to a system that really likes routine and regularity. I mentioned that body clock, that circadian rhythm. It wants to be on time. And so one of the things that we do is actually have people at first limit or restrict or compress the amount of time in bed. Because if you're not asleep, you don't need to be in bed. We want to strengthen that relationship and teach the brain and the body that being in bed means being asleep. So get out of bed, do something else quiet and calming until you feel sleepy again, and then get back into the bed. But don't keep adding time to that time in bed.
Yeah. And something you said hit home for me because I go to bed regularly on the weekdays, but when it's the weekends, maybe I'll go to bed at like one or or two, and it's breaking my cycle. So I know a lot of people may do the same. Carolyn had a baby, so her sleep cycle's all over the place. So yeah.
Those babies, they don't have a sleep cycle. They do not have a circadian rhythm in the first several months, and so
Going on.
they
Yeah.
don't. They You're like, that's nothing new. I know, but no, that's something that people may be surprised to learn is that children, infants don't have a regular circadian rhythm when they're first born, and so they will not get on a schedule. Um, but some of the things that are important to adults, like exposure to light in the early morning and in the early afternoon, and consistency, are still important. I appreciate this urge, right? I want to stay up a little bit later on the weekend, maybe for social activities, or maybe there's a game on, or there's something else that I want to do. And for a lot of people, for healthy sleepers, that'll stretch a little bit. But what people often do is they don't just stay up later, then they sleep later. And when we do that on Friday and Saturday and Sunday, by the time we get to Monday, we're almost jet lagged, right? We sometimes talk about it as like a social jet lag, because now I'm trying to switch back 2 or 3 hours to wake up and be going on Monday morning. And so my encouragement would be, if you are going to stay up later because we want to have a social life, we want to do other things, is that you don't vary your wake up time so much. And so our system will usually flex within an hour or sometimes a little bit more, but trying to keep yourself more on track with those wake up times when you do stay up a little bit later is going to be helpful in keeping you on track.
Yeah. And that brings us to the next point of anxiety, depression, and what sleep stages reveal. Since the pandemic, rates of anxiety and depression remain high, and poor sleep is a common thread. Sleep and mental health are deeply connected.
Yeah, definitely. And I think your book explains REM sleep. That's where our brain is processing emotions, processing trauma, chronic anxiety. All of those things can seriously disrupt our REM sleep. For someone who wakes up anxious or emotionally drained, what does disrupted REM look like? And why does it make emotions feel more intense during the day?
Great question. So, if we think about our sleep stages, we move through several throughout the night, and they're usually divided into REM and non-REM. And REM is rapid eye movement sleep. It's named so because when you are sleeping, your eyes are rapidly moving behind your eyelids. And so there is this part of REM sleep that's really focused, as you mentioned, on emotion regulation and memory consolidation. And so it's an important aspect of our sleep that helps to regulate our emotions during the next day. It is one part of our sleep, though. So the other parts, the other stages of sleep are still important. We have light sleep and deep sleep, and those are important stages. They also have functions. And the sleep stages, we move through each one sequentially and usually in about a 90-minute window. So we'll move through light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, and then repeat. But the quantity of those throughout the night changes. So the first half of the night is loaded heavier. You spend more time in deep sleep, and REM sleep is heavier in the second half of the night. So even if you're moving through all of those stages, you may not be getting all of your needs met there. So if you cut off and wake up earlier and you miss another cycle of sleep, you may miss not just REM, but a greater proportion of your REM. And so because it has such an important function with our emotion regulation, when we lose out on that or it gets compressed, we don't have the tools we need the next day. We know that REM sleep can be disrupted in people with mental health diagnoses. It can also be disrupted in people with other sleep diagnoses. One of the most common being obstructive sleep apnea, which is a sleep-related breathing disorder in which people are not breathing as well as they need to, and their levels of oxygen decrease, and that can happen multiple times within an hour. You're having these micro arousals where you're briefly waking up. And so the quality and quantity of sleep gets decreased, as well as the quality of REM sleep. And that can lead to lots of challenges in the next day. There's a little bit of a chicken and egg piece here where changes in sleep can predict worsening mental health symptoms, but worsening mental health symptoms can also predict worse sleep. So I think it's really important, whether you're somebody who already has struggled with anxiety, depression, or trauma, or you're somebody who struggles with sleep, to be mindful of how all of those pieces impact your mental health and well-being.
And many people blame themselves for when they can't sleep, but your book shows that it's biological and psychological response. We touched a little bit about, getting out of the bed, to help with sleep. Uh, what daily habits make the big difference in restoring healthy sleep and emotional balance?
Mhm. I think it's consistency to some extent. And so, lots of people who have maybe had some trouble with sleeping will do a quick internet search or maybe talk to their friends or even a healthcare provider, and somebody will talk to them about sleep hygiene, right? That the bedroom needs to be cool, dark, and quiet, and they need to limit their caffeine or alcohol or tobacco. And all of those things are can be important. But if we've moved to the point of having an insomnia disorder or a nightmare disorder, it's probably going to add in some other tools to that toolkit to really help people to make those changes. But one of the things that I always start with is a consistent bedtime and wake time. Sleep is a biological drive, just like hunger. And so if we do things to change that throughout the day, it's going to make a difference. So, for example, my drive for hunger is going to build from the time I've eaten until I eat again. If I have a snack, then I'm not going to be as hungry when it comes time for a meal, the same way as if I have not slept well and maybe I take a nap. Or I lay in bed a little bit longer and kind of doze off and on, that may pull away from the amount of sleep I'm able to get the next night. So being consistent with your sleep and wake is a key piece. Not spending too much time in bed, and doing things that are going to support consistency, regular meal times, regular exercise. Unfortunately, it's the same thing that we hear for a lot of pieces. Some of those pieces we just have to do. There's no quick fix. There's no pill. It's putting in work to help with our sleep. Um, but we also have to be attuned to not putting in so much work that we get stuck in um, this effortful sleep, because sleep is a system that doesn't need more energy put into it. And so the more effort we put into sleeping, the more it's likely to be elusive. So trusting our body to do what it can do, but giving it the right parameters, right? Regular opportunity for sleep. And maybe we can talk a little bit about kind of our hustle culture and how sleep gets shortchanged, or viewed as something that's not needed.
Yeah, I again relating to a lot of this, and like you mentioned, it does become almost like a something that sleep becomes almost something that's just on put on the back burner because we assign priority to everything else in life. um, Not understanding how critical it really is to have that reset. And it's a biological need. Just like, I mean, I wouldn't recommend that anyone doesn't use the bathroom for a full day. You're going to feel it. And just because you're not necessarily, just because you're still up and you're still moving around doesn't mean that you're not having that deeper impact on your biological self. So
Yeah.
definitely agree there.
Yeah, and you talked about like the hustle culture, basically disregarding sleep. I know a few people that they're like super hard workers, they're pushing their body to the limit, not getting sleep, and you can tell like sometimes maybe their mood changes or maybe their memory isn't good. Is there any like other effects around that, like skipping out on sleep?
Yeah. You're shortchanging yourself in a lot of different areas. And so a chronic lack of sleep is dangerous. It can be deadly. It's one of those things that we need. And we talked earlier about REM sleep as so important for memory consolidation and mood regulation. It's also those different stages of sleep are also important for our body. And so during deep sleep, for example, muscle and tissue repair happen. And so if I am somebody who is an athlete and high achieving in that way, I need my sleep to make sure that I'm continuing to build muscle. Its cardiac function gets regulated, blood sugar gets regulated. There are so many things that our body is doing. We used to think about sleep as just kind of this period of nothingness. And we've learned over the last really 50 or 60 years that sleep has so many important functions. And so it's a time where, waste products get cleared from our brain. And that can have implications for neurodegenerative disorders, right? If we're shortening our sleep consistently, if we're not letting our body do what it needs to do, then we're putting ourselves at risk for all kinds of different health complications, physical and mental health complications. And it impacts our relationships, right? You mentioned maybe people are a little bit more irritable. Maybe they're a little bit shorter with their friends or family or in business. And so it really has an impact on all these different quality of life domains.
Definitely. Definitely. And I think I want to turn the conversation actually back to something that you mentioned in your intro, linking nightmares and sleep back to trauma. And nightmares affect up to 70% of trauma survivors. And many people find that nightmares continue long after traumatic events. They can be recurring. There's a lot associated with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you write in your book that nightmares are actually learned patterns, and the brain can be trained to follow a new script using imagery rehearsal therapy. Can you walk us through what is and what it looks like in everyday terms?
So, imagery rehearsal therapy is a set of skills that helps people to re-script their nightmares into dreams that they would want to have. And so, if we think about this idea of the REM sleep having connections to the emotional centers of our brain, connected to our memories, then it oftentimes, if we go to sleep in this state of hyperarousal, when it comes time to dream, our brain will pull imagery that matches our mood. It's called the mood matching hypothesis. And so, for people who go to bed anxious, they may find that they have more anxiety filled dreams. For people with a history of trauma, going to bed in that anxious or irritable mood, they may find that they have more images coming back from their trauma experience, whether it's mimicking the exact replay, what we call a replicative trauma dream, or if it's replaying some similar elements or themes. Sometimes we call this symbolic or intermediate nightmares. Then we look at those pieces and pay attention to the fact that over time, if our brain keeps pulling that same imagery, it creates this script of the nightmare. And for a lot of trauma survivors, that same script gets replayed and replayed and replayed. And so the awakenings that happen as part of nightmares become an escape or an avoidance mechanism. And so, in that way, it's a learned behavior that people have this stimulus and then they escape from it. But that continues to create these awakenings, and more awakenings lead to worse sleep, and worse sleep one day leads to more daytime distress. And we kind of get this nightmare cycle, so that having a nightmare one night makes it more likely we'll have a nightmare the next night. In imagery rehearsal therapy, there are actually two forms of nightmare treatment we talk about in the book, the Nightmare and Sleep Disorder Toolkit. We talk about imagery rehearsal therapy, and we talk about exposure, relaxation, and rescription therapy. And both of them are going to target this idea of a nightmare script. And what we have people to do is we have people to rewrite those nightmares, especially for people who are having the same nightmare or one or two that are very similar. And we have them to write a dream that they would like to have instead, because doing that gives people more control, and control is a big piece of nightmares. And then it gives people an option to practice at night. That's this new script, this new story that I want to have a dream about. And then for most people over time and with practice, either they start having the new dream, or sometimes they don't know if they have the new dream or not, because we usually don't wake up from good dreams unless it's at the very end and your alarm's going off, right? But they'll notice that those nightmares fade out over time. And so for imagery rehearsal therapy, we really just have people to rewrite a new dream. For exposure, relaxation, and prescription therapy, we take the old nightmare, that's usually in people who have trauma related nightmares where it's the same thing replaying, and we have them to change it, to change the outcome, or to change it in some key way that makes it less distressing and less impairing for their quality of life. And it's something that kind of sounds simple on the outset, but it really can make a huge difference in people's quality of life when they're not having nightmares anymore and they're able to actually sleep through the night.
No, that's amazing. It's almost like power of suggestion. Like, that's incredible to me. When someone does have a nightmare, let's say they're in the throes of it and they wake up. I've certainly been in the scenario, heart racing, really rapid breathing, maybe not knowing where you are. Do you have any grounding strategies or methods that can kind of help calm the nervous system back so that we can at least try to get back to sleep in that moment?
Yeah. So I think one of the first things that we want to do is we want to attend to kind of that physiological response, right? If your heart is racing and your breathing is going fast, taking in more air when we're in danger is helpful. Taking in more air when we're not physically in danger makes us hyperventilate, and that's going to keep the anxiety going. So working on stabilizing that breathing, inhaling and then exhaling for a longer period of time and fully can really help. For people that have nightmares, we also talk about some grounding strategies, especially if they're trauma-related nightmares, and they may have some difficulty knowing, if they're here or if the trauma is kind of happening again. It's so intense. And so one of the things that we might do is pay attention to what's around them. And so if I'm waking up, how is where I am right now different, right? I work with a lot of people who are veterans or first responders, or who have, been in life-threatening situations away from home or at a different period in their life. And so, if you wake up and you see, right, the bedside table is clearly not would not have been there with you in a combat zone, right? If you wake up and you see a ceiling fan, if you wake up and you feel, your blanket, right? Kind of what can we use in the census to ground people and recognize first, I'm here, I'm in my house, I am safe. And so some of those pieces become really important. Some people will get particular objects that they'll keep with them. I've had people who, would maybe touch their wedding band because they weren't married when their trauma happened, or maybe they keep something on the bedside table that, or a particular scent around that kind of keeps them connected. Those sensory details can be really helpful in grounding people.
Before we go to the next part, I think it's a good place to ask some questions that our audience has messaged us. So, one of the questions were, someone felt like they slept better when it was colder in the room rather than warm. They said they actually had bad dreams when it's like more when they're hot more.
Mhm.
Can you briefly explain that?
Sure. They are right. We need to be cooler to sleep. And there's actually our core body temperature drops when we sleep. And so for a lot of people, keeping their house at a cooler temperature at sleep can be helpful. Scientists have suggested somewhere around 68 degrees. Of course, depending on the person and their power budget, 68 degrees may not be an option, but the cooler you can sleep, the better. That also may mean paying attention to what kind of fabrics that you're wearing. There are certainly sheets or pillows that are hotter or cooler. But we also don't want you to be too cool. So one of the recommendations that comes up that often gets a lot of controversy is whether or not to wear socks at night. And so if your feet are too cold, you're not going to sleep well. But if your feet are too hot, you're not going to sleep well. So it's a personal preference, experiment with it. But yes, cooler temperatures are going to be more sleep promoting than warmer temperatures. And so a fan can be helpful, different types of fabrics. And as we think about transitions in life at perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, sometimes adjusting temperatures and adjusting fabrics, or even having like a cool pack in the bed can be helpful to address nocturnal hot flashes.
All right. We have two more questions from our audience. So the next one, they asked about naps. So
Mhm.
they said if I took a 30-minute nap, I felt like I was more groggy. Could you explain that as well?
Absolutely. So I said earlier, naps are in our biological sleep drive are kind of like snacking in our hunger drive. And so we all get a certain amount of sleep in a 24-hour period. It's individualized. For most healthy adults, it's somewhere between 7 and 9 hours. Sleeping too little and sleeping too much will generally make us feel worse. And so if I take a 30-minute nap during the day, I'm going to pull away from the amount of sleep I'm able to get at night. Um, there's also some discussion to be had about what is a nap, because I'll have patients that tell me they nap, and I'm like, well, tell me about that. And they'll be sleeping for 3 hours in the middle of the day. That is not a nap. Usually we think about naps as most helpful if they're under 30 minutes and before 3 p.m. That's when they're less likely to impact your sleep. And so if you're a person that doesn't have any sleep problems, napping may not be a big deal. If you're sick, I usually do encourage people to nap or to rest a little bit longer. But if somebody's already struggling with their sleep, napping may not be in their best interest. The exception would be for somebody with sleep apnea. If they were feeling so groggy that it was going to be a danger to drive, I'd encourage them to take a brief safety nap before driving.
All right. And the last one, and the one I'm interested in the
Okay.
most. So, some people experience sleep paralysis.
Ah,
Now, this is like, you know, I think I read online where scientists think it's like they're half awake, half asleep. Do you think it's part spiritual too, or do you think it's just biological in nature?
so this is something that has been written about for millennia. It shows up in lots of different cultures and lots of different meaning gets assigned to sleep paralysis. And so, from a biological perspective, what we know is in REM sleep, there's kind of a switch that gets turned off so that our big muscle groups, our voluntary muscles, are not moving. That's a good thing. That keeps us from acting out our dreams, right? If we're running or we're flying, we don't actually want to be able to physiologically do that while we're asleep. It's to protect us. All of the involuntary stuff like breathing still goes, right? And so, one of the ideas about sleep paralysis is that switch is not getting turned off and on in the right way. And so, you may wake up and be aware, but unable to move for a few seconds. It can be really terrifying for people. With that, sometimes people will see things or have images, which is where kind of the spiritual piece comes. Is sometimes people will talk about a hag or a witch riding them, or they'll talk about seeing figures, aliens, ghosts, other kinds of images that may have a less than solid form, right? And so it comes to kind of this spiritual piece with it. And so, whenever I'm working with anyone who experiences sleep paralysis, I want to know, how they're thinking about it, how they've been taught to think about it, because we get a lot of lessons about what sleep is and isn't, depending on where we grow up and who teaches us. And so, if it's something that's distressing and upsetting, then we want to work on seeing if we can change it. But if it's something that represents, a spiritual problem, then I'm certainly going to encourage the person to work on that, to pay attention to that, to maybe we consult. I have, kind of a Rolodex of religious and spiritual leaders that I like to ask and talk with when these things come up, because our sleep and dreaming does reflect concerns and questions from our waking life. And so it can be an important piece for people to work through.
That was great. Yeah, so thank you, audience, for your questions. So we're gonna dive back in. So we're gonna go into practical sleep strategies people can use this week. You went over some, behavioral therapies improve insomnia by 70 to 80% for adults and often have better long-term outcomes than sleep medications.
And I think, one of the uh, messages that is very strong in your book is that these behavioral sleep treatments, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, sleep restriction, they can work better than long-term medication because they are actually retraining the brain, almost like exercise retrains your body, right? So why is retraining the brain so essential for real sleep recovery? Why are you such an advocate for those methods?
So, if sleep is a basic biological process, it's something we're all physiologically hardwired to do, then when that system gets disrupted, it makes sense that if we can change some things, we can figure out what got people stuck and get them unstuck, they can return to baseline. They can come back to doing what their body knows how to do. And I'm a fan of that over medication, because lots of times the medications come with some additional challenges or side effects. For some people, they don't have access to medication, right? It is costly. And depending on their individual physiology, there may or may not be medications that are effective for them. And the science supports that this behavioral intervention is the most effective. When we look at the guidelines, we have clinical practice guidelines that come out from lots of different accrediting bodies that look at all of the research and say, when we compare, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia to medications for insomnia, the preponderance of evidence is in support of CBTI. It is the frontline recommendation by the American Academy of Family Physicians above medication. There can be cases where medication is appropriate, and I work with a lot of providers in collaboration, but I also see a lot of people who've tried medication first and are still having some sleep problems. And in fact, some of the medications change the sleep architecture, the way we move through those sleep stages at night. A lot of sleep medications are meant to be used on a short-term basis, but I'll often see people who have been on them for decades. And so sometimes we do cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia plus a medication taper to help people stop medications.
Mm-hmm. And just a little bit of a tangent for my personal curiosity. Um, with that, something that you can get just over the counter melatonin, do you find that heavily impacts how our body just responds on our baseline biological response, I guess, for sleep?
Yeah. So melatonin is a big question and a big part of the pharmaceutical industry. And I think it has its uses, but not there's not enough evidence in a lot of cases for using melatonin. So our body produces melatonin naturally, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of people are drawn to that supplement. The other thing that I have questions about with melatonin often is it's not well regulated. And so there was a study that came out a couple of years ago from a university where they went and bought 40 over-the-counter melatonin supplements, and they tested them in the lab. And they contained anywhere from 0 to 400% of what the active ingredient was. And so if somebody's going to use melatonin, I often encourage them to go and make sure that they're getting a prescription grade or a pharmaceutical grade that's appropriate. But melatonin for the average person is not something that they necessarily will need. It can be used in small doses to adjust sleep cycles. It can be used for things like REM sleep behavior disorder. But it's something that has a lot of hype, but the evidence there for me is not where I'm comfortable usually recommending it as a frontline treatment. If somebody's already on it, we might talk about how to use it in a way that's going to work with their biology rather than against it, because the dosing does matter and the timing matters a lot. But I just really encourage people to be cautious about melatonin.
Yeah, that makes sense. As someone who I've worked in pharma for all my career, it's all about dosing and the regulation that comes along with it, right? To make sure that something is effective and not potentially harmful or not having any effect at all. So I definitely appreciate your response.
I know a few people that take melatonin to uh, go to sleep. For the people who feel helpless and they tried everything, melatonins, and just different things. What's one realistic change that they can start to do?
So if somebody is really struggling with their sleep, I think one of the things that I would encourage them to do, and one of the things we talk about in the Nightmare and Sleep Disorder Toolkit, is to keep a sleep log for a week. Write down, notice what you're doing. Are you going to bed and waking up at relatively the same time every day? Is there a lot of variability? How much alcohol are you consuming? How much exercise are you getting? How much time are you spending in bed compared to how much time you're actually sleeping? And that may give us an idea about where some of the challenges are and where we can start to make some of those changes.
You just sparked another question. I'm not trying to keep you all here all day, but so Some people, when they drink alcohol, they go to sleep like a baby. And then some people may say, well, I can't really sleep with it. Do you know why that is?
I do know why that is. So, for alcohol, for a lot of people, it will shorten sleep latency. So, they'll fall asleep faster. It's a relaxant. But we know that alcohol actually disrupts the sleep architecture, particularly in the second half of the night. And for people with nightmares, it makes nightmares more likely. And so, if somebody is using alcohol responsibly, we don't necessarily try to change that, but we think about the timing too. When is your body going to be metabolizing that? So having, a drink with dinner as opposed to right before you go to sleep might cause less impact of alcohol throughout the night. And then, of course, quantity is going to make a difference as well. And so we really pay attention to, again, when are you using a substance? And if it's something that, you notice when I do, I tend to wake up 3 or 4 times throughout the night, or I wake up and I kind of still feel groggy, or like I didn't get good quality sleep, then you might want to consider making some changes in timing or dosing.
This has been an amazing conversation. Uh, One of my favorite. Um, now know and understand why sleep breaks down, why nightmares happen, how trauma affects REM, and most importantly, how people can retrain their brain to sleep again.
Yeah, that's right. And in the Nightmare and Sleep Disorder Toolkit by Dr. Worley, you're giving people the step-by-step tools that they may have been missing. Not overwhelming routines, very simple habits based on science, and you've given us plenty of examples of that today. So thank you so much for describing those in detail and helping us understand.
Before we close, do you have one message you want to share to listeners to remember tonight when they're struggling to fall asleep or are afraid to go back to sleep after a nightmare?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that I pay attention to is what are you doing in bed? If you're laying there and you're relaxed, maybe stay there a little longer. If you're awake, you're alert, you're irritable, you're angry, you're scared, we don't want to strengthen that relationship with the bed. Get out. Do something different. Quiet, calming, relaxing. And when you notice that biological cue for sleepiness, where your head is heavy, your eyelids are heavy, get back in bed. And that's going to help in the long run. It's not fun. It's not fun when you have to get out of the bed. Most people just want to stay there, especially depending on the time of year. But in the long run, it's going to make a big difference in your quality of sleep.
Yeah, there has been a lot that you have said, including that takeaway that I will be putting into practice tonight. So thank you so much. For our audience to learn more from Dr. Worley or to order the Nightmare and Sleep Disorder Toolkit, please check out the links in the show notes. We'll have all of her information there. And if today's conversation resonated with you, make sure to like the episode, subscribe to the Dash Wellness podcast, interact with our posts. It obviously helps us helps keep bringing on experts like Dr. Worley, for example, and making mental health and wellness conversations more accessible to the masses. We'd love to hear from everybody in the audience. Please drop a comment. Let us know what mental health topics you want to listen in on, and what experts you would love to have on our podcast next.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. It was great. We'll share all your links to find you, find the toolkit, and it was an amazing conversation.
Thanks so
Yes,
much. I
thank you so
appreciate
much.
having me.
All
Sweet dreams, everybody.
Sweet dreams.
right.